Greetings, everyone. My name is Rikita Madana, and I'm a data science and business analytics graduate student and the student volunteer for today's session. I would like to welcome you all to the 6th annual Charlotte Women in Data Science virtual conference hosted and sponsored by UNC Charlotte School of Data Science and Loves Inc. The WIDS Charlotte Conference initiative aims to inspire and educate data science across the region, regardless of gender, and to support women in the field. With the current state of the world mainly interacting online, we are grateful for your decision to attend our 2-day virtual event and show your support for our various speakers. I would like to extend a special thanks to all of our attendees for showing up and showing your support. I'm happy to introduce our speaker for the hour, Megan Robertson, a senior data scientist from Nike. Thank you.
All right, so thank you for that great introduction. As was said, my name is Megan Robertson. Going to be talking to you all today about how to ace the data science interview. So just quickly, a little bit about myself. Currently work as a senior data scientist at Nike. I have over 3 years experience of the field, and I got my first job in data science after earning a master's in statistical science. And I'm currently working on my first data science book called Mastering Communication in Data Science. And throughout, I'm now, Nike's the second company that I've worked with. I learned a lot about interviewing for data science jobs. And I really wanted to share a lot of that information with you from what I learned from being the person being interviewed, as well as now that I've been working for a few years, I've also sat on the other side of the table where I've interviewed people for data scientists and other positions. So the information I'm going to talk about today is based on my own experience. Again, it could vary a lot by companies, but these are some general tips and strategies that when I talk with students about preparing for interviews that I'll typically share. So really quickly, let's just establish what is the purpose of an interview. This is something that might seem obvious. The purpose of an interview is to get a job, but I wanted to highlight this just because I think, especially for students that are first starting out in the field, they often see the interview as a one-sided transaction. So with the company, they're there to learn more about your experiences, as well as to assess those technical and required skills to see if you're a fit for the role that they're hiring. On the other hand, you as the interviewee, you're trying to really highlight your skills and background, show off a bit to say, hey, here's why I'm a great fit for this role, but you're also there to evaluate the role and company as well. It's supposed to be more a two-sided conversation. And I'll get into more what I mean about that throughout the course of the presentation. So now let's really quickly go over what the interview process could look like and is still pretty typical for a data scientist position. Again, this could vary between different companies, but this is usually what I've seen in my own experience. So typically it'll start off with a phone screen that could be either with HR or with a hiring manager that's in charge of getting the role. That'll usually be just simpler. Why are you interested in the company, in our team? Maybe ask a few simpler questions about things that are based on your resume. Talk about expectations, maybe with salary, stuff along those lines. Then there's sometimes a take-home analysis. So this is something that I've noticed in the past few years is changing a little bit. But what I mean by take-home analysis is oftentimes a company will give you a set of anonymized data, some example questions that are similar to the types of questions that a person in that role would tackle. And you have X number of days to write some code and answer those questions. And that's a way that they use to test technical ability, but also can you apply data science to more abstract situations? Again, companies, this does tend to favor people who have a lot of free time. So if I already work 40 hours a week for a job, or I also have kids, like companies are moving away from those longer take-home analyses just because it does tend to bias certain candidates. but it still is a part of that process. So I wanted to call it out. And then usually if you make it through that, you'll get to a final round where you're meeting and interviewing with more people on the team you'd be working with. Back in the old days, that would usually mean visiting the office for half a day or a day, depending on the company. And you could do more technical questions, but really in person evaluating that fit. So what I'm talking about today is going to apply most likely more towards those final rounds. Again, the interview process will vary a lot by the companies. Some of the stuff could also apply to the phone screen, but we're really focusing more in on those final, what used to be in person are now over Zoom rounds. So there are 3 types of interview questions that we're going to talk about today. Most every question I've ever been asked in an interview, or I've asked a candidate myself, will fall into these 3 areas. First is the behavioral and hypothetical. And oftentimes people will describe these or the skills that they get at as soft skills. I personally cannot stand that term because to me, soft implies less important, not as difficult. So this is areas like teamwork, communication, leadership. But those skills, being a data scientist, are just as important in my day-to-day job as being able to write code and build models. So definitely not a soft skill that should be overlooked at all. Another area that you'll get questions on are technical. So I consider technical anything from coding questions, but also to questions about statistical theory or any sort of math or anything on your resume like that. I know for me, these were always the most nerve-wracking, but we'll talk about how to approach those questions, what you can expect from them. And then lastly, we have the case study. So the case study is usually something more open-ended, where you're presented with a hypothetical situation and the interviewer wants you to talk through how you would go about addressing that open-ended situation, usually to help out another team at the company that you could be working with. So now we're going to start by talking about behavioral and hypothetical. So there are 4 different areas of skills and experiences that an interviewer will typically look for in this behavioral and hypothetical category. So for example, leadership and teamwork. Data science at companies is usually not happening in a vacuum. You're going to be working with other data scientists. You're going to be working with other teams like engineering, product, etc. So they want to see what experience you have working with different people. So below each of these is just an example question. The next slide, we're going to go into actually answering an example question and the strategy behind it and structure of it. But these are just here for your reference, so you get a sense of the types of questions that fall into these categories. So for leadership, when did you have to navigate conflict? How did you handle it? Motivation and values is another area that people will want to learn about. So are you the type of worker where you can go off on your own and you're really motivated to find that best solution by yourself? Or are you going to need a little bit more guidance in terms of finding the right direction? One isn't necessarily better than the other, but they just want to understand how you work. Same with values. Are you a perfectionist? What sort of things get you excited to do your best work? So an example question for that could be, what's your proudest accomplishment? With organization and prioritization, in basically every data science job and internship I've had to juggle multiple projects at a time. That's pretty typical. Not every data scientist job is going to be like that, but they want to see, can you keep track of different deadlines? Can you figure out what needs to get done first? So again, an example, if you had multiple tasks, how would you choose what to do first? And then with the last area is flexibility. So, you come into your work one day and the sky could be falling because things are breaking. They want to just get a sense of, okay, if we had an all hands on deck situation or things changed, how would you adapt to that? So that's what flexibility gets into there. And I will say that I know, because I saw one from some of the Q&As that was submitted before the presentation, but also from conversations with students and my own experience, that a lot of students are very worried about interviews because they don't have any quote unquote real world data science experience that they can point to. And especially with these behavioral and hypothetical questions, it doesn't have to be data science related. So for example, when I had just finished grad school and was interviewing for leadership and teamwork, I would point to examples of things I had learned as the captain of my college basketball team. It doesn't always have to be data science related. So definitely before you interview, take some time for each of these different categories and think about either like a team that you participated in, a club you did, volunteer work that would fall into each of these areas. And with that in mind, let's walk through a behavioral hypothetical question and how I would think about answering it. And here, this was an answer that I would give as someone that was coming right out of school. So say you're in an interview, they say, tell me about a time that you felt stressed or overwhelmed. How did you handle it? Perfect example of this is finals week. Finals week, you've got a bunch of different projects, papers, etc., that are all pretty high stakes or priority depending on how your class is structured. So here we want to think about, one, communicating how you would do that, but also thinking about that previous slide of those 4 different areas. Well, what can I highlight that shows my skills in each of those areas? So for finals week, I'd say create a calendar of assignments and due dates, as well as assign a level of difficulty to each task. So that's showing me, 1, you're organized, as well as prioritization. Maybe I know I can write a paper of 10 pages, no problem, versus my comp sci class, I've been slacking off since the last midterm, and I really need to get after learning those concepts. That paper would have a lower priority than that comp sci class. Again, that's something that I do day to day at work, when I have to balance different stakeholder requests. Another thing that I would mention is I would identify, is there anything else that I need? So maybe with that comp sci course, in 2 days, the TA is having a study session that I need to be prepared for. So factoring that in my decision in terms of figuring out what I'm going to work on next. And lastly, this gets into the motivation and values. So I like having smaller wins along the way. So maybe I'll write 2 pages of that paper and then go study 2 chapters of that comp sci, because that's just showing for me, like, I like to be able to cross things off because it helps with my motivation. So again, this demonstrates your skills in those 2 areas on the right, and it doesn't even have to reference anything with data science. So now let's talk about technical questions. I know for me, this was always the most stressful part of the interview, because it seems like there's a wide array of topics. And I will say too that this is something that, in my own experience, varied a lot from company to company. Some companies, it would just be that take-home assignment. That was the extent of their technical questions. Others, I would have to go in person and we'd be whiteboarding code. So again, it really will depend on the company a bit, but there are 2 areas that technical questions almost always will fall into. The one side is math models and algorithms, and the other is coding. So with our left side, typical questions would be asking you to talk about the pros and cons of using a method. So maybe, why would I want to use logistic regression, or why would I not want to use logistic regression? Model assumptions. So making sure you're understanding any limitations of models that you could potentially be using day to day. Sometimes I've gotten questions on probability theory, And lastly, a big one that will come up is to explain a method in simple terms. So a big part of being a data scientist is being able to communicate what you're doing with people who aren't data scientists and may not have even taken a statistics course at all. So in terms of like the specific models and all of that, there's two things I'll say about that. One is if it is on your resume, it is fair game. So if you say on your resume, I fit a random forest model to do X, Y, and Z, I would anticipate questions of, well, why did you do a random forest model? Can you explain how that model works in simple terms? Another way to kind of get a sense of what they might ask about is looking at the job description. So if you're applying for a data scientist position that's particularly focused in natural language processing, I would anticipate questions on those types of models as well. On the coding side of things, I think every position I've ever applied for requires SQL. So it's not uncommon to see a SQL question either in a take-home exam or in person in your interview. Those will typically be something like, okay, say you had these two tables and I wanted you to get this final table at the end. How would you go about doing it? So that usually I tell students stuff like knowing your joins, like inner, outer, how to filter based on your data. Group bys are all pretty common. Some companies might ask you to whiteboard an algorithm. I'd say some of the more difficult interviews that I had I had 45 minutes or hour, whatever the session was, and I had to write out k-means on the whiteboard in Python. Data structures, parallel computing might come up. Again, if you don't know every term that's on this slide, do not freak out. This will be very tailored to your own experiences. So for me, I took some comp sci undergrad. So it made sense for me to get questions on data structures because I had studied that and that was on my resume. So again, think about what's on your resume, but also what's in the job description in terms of anticipating what sort of coding questions that you could get, as well as what areas of models and theory that they might ask you about. So let's go through a quick example of what a technical question could look like. So let's say you are in an interview, they say, write a function to implement students' t-tests for independent samples. So this here is good. It's testing some like intro level statistical theory, and it's also looking at your coding experience. So this here, the examples in Python, that's just the language I know best, but usually in an interview, they'll let you choose the language you're most comfortable in. But I always start out with a technical question, especially with coding. Think about what are the steps that I need to get this done. And I'll go and I'll write those steps out on the whiteboard, because then you can think about that really helps you break down that code into smaller chunks that you can then attack. I think a mistake a lot of people will make is in a coding question, especially if it's part of a longer interview, they just from the start try to write everything start to finish, and that can leave you really prone to making mistakes along the way. So on the left here, we have some steps of our t-test, defining hypotheses, we're checking assumptions, calculating the test statistic. Okay, I know I need my mean and my standard deviation for that. Then I need to get my p-value, which requires the degrees of freedom, and a test conclusion. And as you're writing this out, talk to your interviewer throughout, because they're there to learn about how you think, how you organize, how you tackle things as well. So even if, like, it's not uncommon to make a mistake, because you're very rarely are you ever writing code from memory, but make it a conversation with the person that you're interviewing as well, so they can follow along your logic. So here on the right is just an example of, okay, I know step one, there's not going to be a ton of code for that. Maybe I would just define a variable to store my significance level. Checking assumptions would be writing code to make a graph, all of that sort of stuff, so I can make sure everything looks right. But I did an example here of what this code would look like for step 3 with that test statistic. So you can see at the top, that's getting our mean and standard deviation. Next line, getting that standard error for each population, then the overall, and then that test statistic. And as I would go through like writing each of these lines of code, again, I would say to the interviewer, okay, well, I know I need to get these sample means, so that's what this line is going to do. Keep that communication open throughout the process. So you would go through those list of steps. You can write that smaller chunk of code for each. This is a pretty simple example. So we could just take our different code chunks from those steps and put them in order, as you can see on the left here. But again, when you get into more complicated questions where you might have to define other multiple functions and call them in, that's where that breaking down into steps really helps. So I always recommend that, especially in an interview. Nerves tend to kick in, and that really helps you to stay organized throughout the process. And then communicate your thought process and plan. This is an opportunity where you can learn a little bit about the company, how the people work, the culture, because if you get stuck, like I said, you're talking through, you say, okay, here's where I'm stuck. I know this is what I need to do next. And you can judge the interviewer as well as how they're responding to that. So are they helpful in getting you to figure out what's next? Or is it a company that expects you to have all of this stuff memorized? Like that tells you different things potentially about the culture there. The last type of question that we'll talk about today is the case study. So again, that case study is usually more of an open-ended business problem where the interviewer wants you to talk about how you would use data science to address that situation. And when I'm answering a case study question, there are 3 different areas that I want to make sure that I'm demonstrating to the interviewer that I'm keeping in mind and thinking about. So first is to understand business strategies. So they want to see that you understand how data science fits into those bigger pictures and goals. So make sure you're making sure that you're thinking about the company vision, any longer term strategies that they're thinking about, and then also understanding what does success look like. Like some companies out there, for example, say like, by this year, we want to double our revenue, for example. You also want to demonstrate that you can collaborate with other teams and that you understand your relationship with other teams as the data scientist. So first, understanding what their roles and goals are. So how do they measure success as well? You'll also need to communicate complex analyses and models from time to time. So making sure you understand what's their level of experience with data science and more technical problems. And then a great old company buzzword, KPIs, which are key performance indices. And those are really quantitative ways that people measure success. So for a marketing team, for example, a KPI for them would be click-through rate. So if I'm showing company ads to users, what's the number of people who actually clicked divided by the number of people who actually saw them? And then lastly, you want to show that you can evaluate priorities and feasible solutions. So thinking about, say you build a model, what product or output can you deliver that would make sense in this situation? And also showing that you're conscious of potential budget and timeline restrictions as well. So let's walk through a case study really quickly. So say you're in an interview and they say, describe how you would build a model to predict if a customer will click on an advertisement. And these 4 steps are what I use to guide my answers to case study questions. So first, make sure that you understand the problem. Like you should be asking your interviewer questions. That's not going to show weakness at all. It's showing that you're really thinking about the details of it. So make sure you know how we're defining success. Has anything been done in the past? Because that can help inform your own ideas of either what to avoid or something to build upon. What is the overall goal? So do we want more people to click on ads to drive traffic? Do we want them to eventually make a purchase from the website of whatever company this is? And then also, I always mention that there's some exploratory data analysis involved, because you want to make sure that the data is clean, it's showing that you're understanding the process of a data science project. You could have outliers, you could have missing data issues. So that's what I like to cover in that first section. Next, I'll propose what I call a simple approach. You may have heard some people will say brute force, because you want to establish something that gives you a baseline and see if it works. So in our example, let's say we fit a logistic regression model to start because it's easy to fit computationally. As I was saying, it can give us that baseline. It might not be our final product for this case study, but I now have a way, as I think about other methods, I can go back and compare to this. This can also help you get to what's called a minimally viable product, or MVP. So that's something that works, that I can put in front of my stakeholder. In this case, it would probably be our marketing team if they're concerned about advertisements, and get feedback from them that I can then use as I go into my next phase. That next phase that I'll talk about is then thinking about how to improve the approach. So what are some next steps I would take as I had more time and resources? And here it's also important to make sure that you understand that there is a trade-off between performance and complexity. So I think especially with students, a lot of them really want to show off all of their knowledge, which is great. You've spent a lot of hard work learning it. But the reality is, when I'm doing data science in practice, sure, I might be able to build a neural network in this situation, but that's not always going to be what's best at the end of the day. So say our logistic regression, for example, predicts if a person's going to click with 67% accuracy. I fit a neural network and it gets it up to 68.5%. So that's a situation where I would probably still go with that simpler approach, just because the computing cost as well as the time to upkeep that neural network model is a lot more. So make sure that you're demonstrating that you do understand that sort of nuance in these situations. And then lastly, I like to make sure that I talk about how I would socialize results. So one, this shows that you understand your stakeholder capabilities. I've worked with teams where I could put model predictions in a dashboard, and I know that they'd be able to understand and get everything I need out of it. Some other teams who might not be as technical or data savvy need a summary report that says, okay, here are the important things that we need to know from this analysis. And then also thinking about a long-term plan. So moving forward, is this going to be a model that we refit every week, every month? Just showing that you're also thinking about that longer term vision is great as well. So then one of the last things I want to touch on is asking questions. So as I said at the beginning, the interview is a two-way street. You're also here to evaluate the company. And while I recognize that there are situations where people might not be in a position that they could turn down a job offer, it is something to keep in mind, is if you're seeing a lot of red flags during the interview process and your gut's really not feeling great about it, that's not a great sign that you're going to feel better about it, or that things are going to go well when you get there. And one of the ways you can try to learn more details is by asking questions. So basically every interview at the end, you'll usually be time for questions. There were two areas that were really important to me in my career that I would try to learn more about. So one is cultural fit. And for me, this meant a few things. I know I didn't want to be working weekends. I wanted to be in a place where it was really collaborative environment as opposed to competitive, and that people really felt inspired about the work that they did. So some questions that I would ask to learn more about that: what's the project you're most proud of that you've worked on? What's your favorite part about working on this team and company? And with these, I did interviews where people would answer these questions and it'd be very vague. 2-3 sentences versus places where I found people genuinely enjoyed the people that they worked with, as well as the type of things that they were doing. Like, you could just see in their face, they were a lot more excited, could talk in a lot more detail about it. Another question would be, what does a typical day look like? For me, if they're saying they're answering emails right up until they go to bed, that was a red flag. And then also understanding, why did you join this team or company? So that'll just help you learn a little bit more about the values of the people that you would potentially work with, as well as the company. The other big area I always wanted to learn about was career development. I think this is especially important for if you're interviewing for one of your first jobs. So how is success defined in this role? And then also, where do you see this team in 1 year, 3 years, some time period? And for me, I was looking for an answer that had a pretty clear definition, especially for my first job coming out of grad school, because that tells me something about that the hiring manager or HR has really thought through this and recognized how to help that person development. On the other side, if this is a little bit more vague, that could be an opportunity where you'll be able to come in and really guide yourself in terms of what you want to learn and do. So again, it's not necessarily a red flag, but for me in my first roles, I wanted a little bit more guidance. And then I also always ask, are there resources available for continued learning and professional development? It seems like every 5 seconds, there's a new model algorithm in data science that everyone's raving about. I feel like the past couple of years, it's been the whole neural network craze. So making sure that that company is investing both hopefully monetarily, but also in giving you like work time to go to a conference or take an online class. Because as a data scientist, you're going to be learning a lot basically throughout your whole career. So in closing, there's just 3 general tips I wanted to emphasize. 1, preparation is key. So that means researching the company ahead of time. It's great. You always want to have questions to ask during an interview, but if a candidate comes in and asks a question that they can find in 5 seconds on my website, that tells me about how much they've prepared for the opportunity. Go have a classmate, a friend, a family member ask you questions and practice actually your answers out loud. You'll become more comfortable and it'll feel more natural in an interview when you're speaking about it. And also, like, especially for students who don't have as much of that industry experience, think about other areas of your life that show some of those skills I talked about earlier in the hypothetical behavioral section as well. It doesn't have to be all data science all the time. Second, remember you're evaluating the company. Again, if there are red flags, your interviewers are all really rude, that's telling you a lot about that company. And then lastly, do not lie or over embellish, because one of 2 things will happen. 1, we'll find out during the interview and you won't get the job, or 2, we'll find out on the job and that's really not a good look either. I know some people feel like they need to show how much they know, and it's fine to say that you don't know something, because oftentimes like that won't discount you as a candidate. It could just be us generally trying to figure out, okay, what are the areas of expertise that you have? What are some things that we just have to make sure that you learn on the job? And with that, I will take some questions. And here is, I have a website that I have some other talks I've given, as well as a Twitter. So there's forms for questions on there as well after the fact, if you have anything else that comes up. So we have a question about, are there any resources you would recommend us to use as preparation for the technical side of the interview? Yes. So there's a lot out there, which is great. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head any particular sites, but I know I would just search on Google like example data science technical questions. you can also go to, it's not called CodePen, but you can also Google like example Python interview questions. I know that's a really vague answer. I haven't prepared for an interview in a while now, so I just don't know off the top of my head. But it's definitely like there's so many blogs out there about it that you can just throw like a stone on the internet and you should find one. So again, I recommend that you do a mix of some like simpler questions, like a simpler coding question would be in Python, like return the even numbers in this list, but then also look for some that are a bit more involved in terms of theory. Okay, so then here's another question. So what advice would you have for someone to ensure they land with a great team? Sometimes information is hidden about the leader. And how would you introduce a new way of thinking from the applicant perspective? Why should I work for you? And what are some issues you might not be telling me? Yeah, so this is definitely like something that's a little bit harder. So some of those questions that I talked about for cultural fit can get some information about that. But obviously, if you're interviewing with the leader of a team and everyone hates them, you might not find that out. Someone's not going to tell someone who's interviewing, hey, maybe you should look somewhere else. So I think really pay attention to those answers when you're asking about their work, what they enjoy about working at that company. Another thing that you can ask is if you're ask about like what's the usual amount of time that someone stays in this role. The person, if it's not a new role, you can ask the person who previously held this role, where did they go? Did they move externally? Were they promoted? Ask about like typical turnover on the team as well. So those are questions that you can get a little bit more concrete with. Obviously, they could just lie about that, which would be awful. But also what's great now is like there are sites like LinkedIn. So search data scientists at this company, see what comes up. You can see if people tend to be sticking around. Is it a shorter stint? Okay, so apart preparing about the company details, what it's about, what are some other details that we can use to prepare? Yeah, so I'd say definitely go on the company website. There's usually an About Us section. Sometimes companies will publish publicly like what their company values are or motto that they live by. So that sort of information. And then I would also just search. There are some great data science companies out there that will publish blogs about their work. So like I know Stitch Fix has a pretty active data science blog. So seeing if there's that sort of information available, or if the people that you're interviewing with, maybe they post their own blogs on their website or something. But also just, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. I might have to come back to that one because I had another point and I forgot about it. Oh, so also then do like a quick search of the news or business news to see was there any big wins or anything big in the news for that company. So maybe they just made an acquisition or something like that. So those are the types of things that I mean when I say doing the research. Okay, what are your views on Googling while completing a technical in-person interview? So as long as the company didn't say you couldn't, I'm all for it. In my day-to-day, I have like at least 10 Stack Overflow tabs open. Companies know, I don't know of any company that you have to do your work without the internet coding from memory. If you apply somewhere like that, I would strongly urge you to not work there. That sounds awful, but yeah, as long as the company is fine with it and doesn't restrict it, that's, in my opinion, is 100% fine. I will say though that any code that you're that you wrote, like using resources that you Googled, make sure that you do understand what is happening there. As a lot of you probably know, in writing code, there's multiple ways to do things. Some are more elegant than others, some take longer. So just make sure that, say you make it to the next round in an interview and they ask you to explain what's happening in the code, that you do truly understand it. That would just be my only caution with that. And then I say, is the slide deck available for us? So I do believe that after the conference, you should be able to download it. But if not, I usually will upload the slides that I give for public presentations on my website as well. Just scrolling through here to make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay. I think I covered all the questions in the chat, but say it looks like we have a couple minutes if anyone else has any other questions that they want me to address. Okay, so it looks like I've addressed everything. Like I said, the information you can use to contact me is here. Always happy to answer questions that I can. Oh, we got one. So what recommendations do you have to get into a large company such as Nike? This is another great question. So I'd say one of the biggest things that I learned from what my interviews looks like right after school versus kind of when I was moving on to my second job is I highly recommend that you invest more time in networking and reaching out to people. I know it's really easy to go on LinkedIn. I think you can literally just click apply and apply to like 50 jobs in 10 minutes with your LinkedIn. But for me, reaching out to people and building that network was most helpful. That's eventually what helps me get into Nike right now. So when I say like reach out, don't just go messaging random strangers saying, hey, I'm interested in this role, will you recommend me? I get those a lot. That's a really big turnoff. One, because you're asking someone to like put their professional reputation on the line to recommend them and they don't even know you. But use one, like your schools that you attended usually have an alumni directory, or even the program can. Just email people and say, hey, we went to the same school. I'm studying this. I saw you work as a data scientist at this company. I'm really interested in learning more about that. Like, do you mind taking a phone call? Because that you'll get so much information out of, and just learning about the field, how they got into it. But also oftentimes by the end of it, so many alum I talked to told me like, hey, if there's a job that comes up that you're interested in, like send me your resume and I can submit it for you. So I find that helps, especially with the larger companies, just because like companies like Nike, like Google, like Facebook, they get so many applicants online that without having a way to get your resume to the top of that pile, you could check every box off, but your resume just might not get seen. So I'd say invest more time in networking than even like applying to jobs online, just because making that connection, having that conversation tends to lead to a more fruitful result. All right, so I got one more question and I think we'll be at time. So how would you say your basketball background helped with your career? I played college basketball as well. Ah, cool. Yeah, so at a company like Nike, it was very helpful. Obviously, we are very athletic. We love athletics here. So that helped with that aspect. I've also like applied for jobs or interned with like professional sports teams. I've interned with an MBA team, so obviously that background really helped a lot more there. But I think a lot of it comes down to, goes back to those different areas that I was talking about for those hypothetical behavioral type questions. So talking about leadership and working as a team, how to handle difficult conversations or difficult situations, because as you know, you are on a team of 12, 15 people, like people are going to butt heads from time to time. So for me, it was really just able to, like, those experiences helped me show some of the skills that aren't as directly related to data science and have that as an example in an interview. All right, great. Well, thanks so much for coming, guys.
Thank you so much, Megan, for being a part of this as one of our speakers. I guess all of us here, all the data scientists out here know how a data science interview would typically look like. It was really informative. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks for having me.